Pepperdine, you'll not only see policy differently, you'll see your future differently from here too.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean here of Pepperdine's School of Public Policy, and I welcome you here tonight to the 2018 Patricia Tagliaferri Dean's Distinguished Lecture with Dr. Charles Murray on the topic, Pursuing Happiness in the Age of Trump. We are joined tonight by such a terrific array of university leadership, members of our Board of Regents, Public Policy, including our Board of Advisors, faculty, students, and staff. So on a personal privilege, I just want to thank you all for making tonight such a special evening and one that is becoming an annual event here at the School of Public Policy. But tonight would not be possible without the support and friendship of Dr. Gus Tagliaferri. And so to you, Gus, and your family who is with us here tonight, thanks. He hates it when I do that. To know Gus is to know a man who is deeply concerned with the great ideas and the foundations for what makes America such an exceptional nation. The theme for this lecture series, named for Gus's beloved late wife, Patricia, is to welcome speakers who understand the pivotal role all of the liberal arts play in national affairs. This is in keeping with what makes the School of Public Policy itself distinctive, in that we are preparing leaders to consider what is the public's role in something called public policy. We began planning this event last October, right? And tonight's speaker was our first and only choice. In last year's lecture, Dr. Neil Ferguson from Stanford University and the Hoover Institution led a fascinating discussion on why policymakers should bring a greater understanding of history to their decision-making, to consider that great cloud of witnesses, to borrow from Scripture, those who've gone before us, when setting the course for generations to come. Tonight, we'll explore how political science and political philosophy can help us understand this current era and find a possible way forward. And we'll do that with the most learned, and I would argue prophetic, guide. Dr. Charles Murray is an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Harvard and his PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the author or co-author of numerous books on topics ranging from education policy reform to America's space program. But tonight, I've asked him to speak on two books in particular, which, though they are spaced 24 years apart, speak to our present political moment in powerful ways. The first, In Pursuit of Happiness and Good Government, published in 1988, is part political science, part political philosophy, outlining the ways we can understand and evaluate the best possible public policy framework for the right ordering of society to produce the greatest amount of human happiness, classically understood. The second book, Coming Apart, published in 2012, is a book so important I question if you can really understand our current political environment without having read it. In it, Murray examines the original closeness and increasing separation of America's lower middle class and upper middle classes, translating their characteristics into two fictional towns called Fishtown and Belmont. In a terrific review of Coming Apart by last year's Tagliaferri lecturer, Neil Ferguson writes, and I quote, "The key point is that the four great social trends of the past half century, the decline of marriage, the work ethic, slight difficulty in movement here, you will notice in your brochure folders there note cards for questions. And as you have them, please write them down or pass them to the aisle at the conclusion of Dr. Murray's remarks. I'll then ask these questions from the cards. So you know Dr. Murray has graciously committed to joining us in a post-event reception for further conversation. As Justin wanted, tonight is a night to better understand this country we love so dearly, and to come together around a new appreciation of the great ideas. So please join me then in giving a warm Pepperdine welcome to our 2018 Patricia Tagliaferri Dean's Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Charles Murray.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be back in Pepperdine. Malibu, as I put it a few minutes ago, is not hard duty. You didn't do so well on The View today, but other than that, it's been great. This topic for the lecture tonight came about because Pete Peterson saw my retirement lecture at AEI when I described In Pursuit as being the toughest book I had written, the hardest work for me. And so he said, well, how about if you combine In Pursuit with the fact that Donald Trump is President of the United States? And it's one of these things that sounded like a good idea at the time. And what he really did was produce the hardest topic for a speech I've ever had to deal with. Because among other things, I don't think there's any way I can do this without antagonizing at least a third of the audience. Because there are, Donald Trump is simply too polarizing, and I will be saying some things that won't please everybody. But I hope that I will be able to describe some of the reasons that Donald Trump is problematic for the pursuit of happiness, especially for Fishtown. Let's start out with what I'm talking about when I use that elusive word happiness. I have a very specific definition in mind, drawn from Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. The way I phrase it is, happiness consists of lasting and justified satisfaction with life as a whole. The stingers in that definition are first lasting, so I'm not talking about ephemeral pleasures. A bowl of hot buttered popcorn is a pleasure, but it doesn't last. And the word justified, which means that actually being in a state of euphoria because you've taken a lot of opioids is not a justified source of satisfaction. It has to be something that has meaning to a rational human being. And in the course of writing that book, the four institutions of meaning, as I now call them, are that through which human beings pursue happiness are, and I challenge you to think of a fifth one, vocation, family, community, and faith. I'm willing to say that causes can be substituted in some cases for a combination of faith and vocation, but essentially those are it as far as the kinds of things which let you to get to be my age, 75, and look back on who you've been and what you've done and take satisfaction in it. Parenthetically, when I first wrote In Pursuit, I was 45, and what I would do in lectures, I would say, the things that when you reach the age of 70, you can look back. It never occurred to me I'd be giving that speech when I was 75. These four domains should be ones in which all people can participate. Everybody ought to be able to be a good neighbor in a community, to be a good spouse, to have a vocation that you work hard at and that gives you a way to exercise your realized talents, and to be engaged in a faith tradition that is satisfying. Should work for everybody. The problem is that it's harder for those who get the short end of the stick for reasons not their fault. Harder in this sense. You don't have to tap into all four the institutions of meaning in order to be happy. It's better if you can do that, but you can have just a couple. That can go a long way toward producing a satisfying life. The thing is, the people in this room generally have a fairly easy time of finding satisfaction in our vocation. We've got the education and the resources and so forth to do it. But here is the stark fact. What I am about to say, I have been booed for saying on college campuses. Half of the population is below average in intelligence. Half of the population is below average in charm. Half of the population is below average in physical attractiveness. Half of the population is below average in persistence. Some people get the short end of the stick on several of those dimensions. So they aren't that smart, they aren't that charming, they aren't that good looking, they aren't that dogged and persistent. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to have a satisfying life, doing the things I just talked about, being a good neighbor, being a good spouse, being engaged in a faith tradition, and working hard at whatever their vocation is. The fact is, over the last 60, 70 years, we have made it increasingly difficult for people who have gotten the short end of the stick to do that. Let's just take some examples of this. First, in terms of faith has been pretty much left alone by social policy. But I have to say that faith has been declining, specifically among the working class, much more rapidly than it has been declining elsewhere. This came as a surprise to me. I'd always thought that, yes, the pointy-headed intellectuals were becoming more secular, but down in the heartland, and particularly in the working class, was where religious faith was being sustained, and I was wrong. It is being sustained in the middle class, and actually the upper middle class is still reasonably religious. There's been a great falling away in the working class. Why that has been is something I hope I will have time to come back to later. In terms of work, it's as if social policy has done its very best to take the dignity and the satisfaction out of work. It used to be that it was a defining characteristic of being a real American and a good American. And it was taken as part of the way we were supposed to think about things. That I may be a professor or I may be an executive in a big company, but a guy who's working on the assembly line and making a living and putting a roof over the head and food on the table for his family is every bit my equal in every important respect. That was the way Americans were supposed to think, and that has also diminished drastically over the last several years. Part of it is due to this new upper class that I talked about in Coming Apart, that we referred to, that was referred to by Pete very briefly, which is to say that we have had a new upper class which has become increasingly isolated from the rest of America and tend to look down on things like holding on to a menial job. But something else happened, and that is social policy and welfare policy changed that mantra that any job gives you dignity into you're working for chump change, and you are a pawn of the system for working for chump change. And the status that you used to have in the neighborhood for holding on to a menial job but making a living turned into people making fun of you because you were foolish enough not to be able to game the system and get sources of income from a vastly expanded welfare system that occurred in the 1960s and the 1970s. Arthur Brooks has another name for vocation, which in some ways I think is better. He refers to the sanctification of ordinary work, which used to be part of the American ethos and no longer is. One of the major sources of satisfaction for men in working has been gutted in many important respects. In terms of the community, the growth of the welfare state in the 1960s and 70s in effect had a benign purpose which you might summarize as taking the trouble out of things. So you have all sorts of services that become available as well as resources, and they take the trouble out of things. So now if you have a problem with a neighbor, you can ship it downtown to a bureaucracy down there. Problem is that the functions that they took over from the neighborhood are the things that make a neighborhood work. They're the things that make it being satisfying to be part of a neighborhood where people get together and are solving problems on their own. I am not being nostalgic when I say that this was a characteristic of American neighborhoods that Tocqueville commented on in the 1830s, but has continued into the 21st century in many parts of small-town America. I live in a town of 152 people. We had a woman who was undergoing chemotherapy for a matter of months, and every single night, somebody in that town was assigned. We had a rotation and got a meal to the family and the kids. And we did it as a matter of course. You still do that things in small towns. It's harder to do that kind of thing in big cities, even though they used to have functioning neighborhoods in big cities, because the welfare state has gutted the kinds of things that neighborhoods did that made them vital places to live. But the worst of all is the damage in the pursuit of happiness has to be what policy did, along with some other developments, to the family. The family depends on people behaving in unnatural ways, which is to say that guys, when they're late teens, early 20s, their natural inclination is not to say, gee, I think I'll settle down and become responsible and make a living and take care of my kids. On the contrary, given a chance to sow wild oats and otherwise run riot, that's the ages at which young men have the most juices flowing that make them want to do that. And yet somehow throughout history and across cultures, young men have reached those ages and have gotten married and taken care of families. How was this done? It was done by a combination of really powerful carrots and really powerful sticks. The carrot, and unfortunately there is, I'm afraid, a gender bias in who got the carrots and who got the sticks. For the men, the carrot was that cultures devised ways of saying to young men, this is the way you become a man. A mensch in that wonderful Yiddish word. And becoming a man means that you have a wife and children that you take care of. And if you do not do that, you are kind of, you're lacking in manhood. For the women, the sticks were very severe. If they got pregnant and had a child without a man, they were shunned, the child was shunned. Economically, it's almost impossible in traditional societies and in the 19th century in America to make a living. If you're a single woman trying to raise a child, and the stigma was enormous. In the 1960s and 1970s and thereafter, it was as if there was a collusion between academia and the government as to who can do the most to undermine these sources of satisfaction and carrots for the guys and to undermine the sticks applying to the women. So you had a welfare system that first made it economically feasible for women to have a child without having a husband, especially if their only option was a low-income husband. And once you had more women having children when the economic penalties were lifted, the stigma started to evaporate. It's one thing if you have one girl in the high school class who's gotten pregnant. She will feel uncomfortable even if nobody teases her about it, even if nobody is bad to her. But if you got 3, 4, 5, 6 girls who are getting pregnant and having babies in the high school classroom, and then you have sort of a daycare center for the kids, all at once that stigma erodes, and that happened. Also, by the way, along the same time, we must mention the sexual revolution which came along, which also, and this is something that's amazing how seldom they comment on this, meant that men could have regular sexual access to a woman without getting married. I know to the younger members of the audience, this is going to sound like I'm making it up, but there was a time when, for most guys, that's the only way you got regular sexual access to a woman. And that, as an incentive to get married, should not be discounted. In any case, you had a situation in which the domains within which the pursuit of happiness takes place got gutted of their vitality and their richness. And what are some of the statistical results of that? Well, take vocation and work. In 1968, almost all members of the working class who were males were at least in the labor force, even if they weren't employed. They were available for work, 96% of them. And that remaining 4% is probably not too far from the percentage that did have some kind of disability that prevented them from working. As of 2017, that number is closer to 20% that are out of the labor force. It's a huge increase. Marriage. In 1968, among the working class, you had upwards of 85% of all those between the ages of 30 and 50 that were married. Marriage was alive and well in the working class. That number is now down to about half. As for children out of wedlock, in 1968, that number was still in single digits for the entire population. Now it is for the working class in the neighborhood of 50% plus. By the way, this is not a racial issue. Among white working class women, the proportion of babies out of wedlock is about 50%. It has been a revolution in the nature of the dissolution of the family. You also have something that I did not look into during the preparation of Coming Apart. It was discovered by some economists at Princeton, and that is you had a huge increase in the 2000s among white working class in opioid use and alcoholism and other causes of death. One of the very few populations in the world that had a reduced lifespan from 2000 to 2010 were working class whites altogether in the United States. You had enormous demoralization that took place. In all of those ways, it's not just in the age of Trump that you have a problem of pursuing happiness among those in the working class. It is a problem that has been building for a long, long time. What in particular does Donald Trump have to do with it? Okay, well, here's the point at which it's time to put my cards on the table. This is full disclosure. I think Donald Trump is a jerk. And I think he is unfit to be president of the United States. Now, having said that, I am in the same position that a lot of you may be who feel the same way, which is that some good things have happened in the last year that would not have happened if Hillary Clinton had been elected. I am glad that Scott Gottlieb is head of the FDA. They've done some really good things that will make it easier for a lot of us to get life-saving drugs. I'm happy that we have had the changes at EPA that we've had rollback of regulations that have occurred, that the federal judges with whose philosophy I agree have been appointed and confirmed. These and other things are all good things that have happened. And I will also add that I'm a lot less concerned about Donald Trump becoming an authoritarian president and changing the American presidency in a fundamental way than I was a year ago. So all of that is good. Why then do I still think that Donald Trump brings an extra dimension to the problem of pursuing happiness in the age of Trump? It has to do with another element in the pursuit of happiness that I haven't mentioned, and that is that even though you can pursue happiness in the four domains that I mentioned, regardless of the political system, people feel a need to be part of something larger. I'm reminded of being in Moscow in 1990, just before the fall of the Soviet Union, and we had friends of friends that we were introduced to who were our hosts while my wife and I were there, and they were wonderful. And the friendships that we saw among the people we met there were real friendships, and the families were strong families. They were pursuing lasting and justified satisfaction with life as a whole, as I talked about it, but there was something missing. And the something that was missing is that they were living in a culture and at a time which was enormously dispiriting, and in which they were having to sort of hunker down in the midst of a barren support system from the larger culture. And in a way, I think that what's going on in the United States has a similarity to that. I refer to it as the soundtrack for America. A soundtrack like a movie has a soundtrack, which has made historically Americans feel that they were part of something special. And what they felt part of something special was, to use the social scientist term, was creedal America, C-R-E-E-D-A-L, a country with a creed. And that creed was variously expressed by various authors, but its essential elements were freedom and individualism and equality, with equality defined in the sense it was defined in the Declaration of Independence, an equality of human dignity, an equality in the eyes of God. And these things made us think of ourselves as being special. And by the way, they also made the rest of the world think of the United States as special. I don't mean to say that everybody thought we were so terrific. The Europeans in particular saw us as being kind of large, bumbling children, way too enthusiastic, way too ready to ask personal questions upon first meeting them, way too proud of our country and all the rest of it. But Americans were a breed apart. And we Americans felt that way too, and we were proud of that, and we were proud of our creed. In America, every person is just as good as everybody else. I'm not saying we made good on those ideals. I'm saying they were the consensus ideals, and we bought into it, and that's what we bragged about, constantly bragged about in the eyes of a lot of the rest of the world. And that soundtrack, what I've really been describing about the previous decades was, that soundtrack has been getting scratchier and tinnier and less persuasive, and I think Donald Trump has added to that in important ways. Initially, I was going to do that by pointing out all the ways in which virtues which were taken as virtues by Americans are not represented so particularly well by Donald Trump. I went so far as to get a list of the 7 heavenly virtues and the 7 deadly sins: greed, envy, lust, wrath, pride. And there's the virtues: kindness, chastity, we'll skip over that one, temperance, patience, humility. And I said, now, if I try to go through and say, Mr. Trump has problems with a bunch of those, it's not going to do any good. Let me take 3 examples that I think illustrate how Donald Trump has taken our problems one step further. The first of these examples has to do with the law. Americans are historically very law-abiding. De Tocqueville talked about that too. He had never seen a country where so few magistrates were required to keep the law, that Americans had enormous respect for the law, and if somebody broke the law, every man's hand was against him, as Tocqueville put it. And that still persists. As any of those of you who have ever been in Minneapolis, when the temperature is 15 degrees below zero at 10 o'clock at night, and you're going down the street and you see people standing at red lights waiting even though there's not another car within 3. That's law-abiding. That still persists, but it is in the context of a legal system which has become increasingly lawless over the last several decades. Lawless in its complexity, objectivity, lawless in the discretion that is given to prosecutors as to who they decide to prosecute and what they decide to prosecute them for. Lawless in the sense that a government regulatory bureaucrat can go to a business person, a small business person, tell him that he has broken some obscure regulation, levy a big fine on him, and if the business person says, but I didn't do anything wrong, I'm going to fight this in court, the bureaucrat can say to him, you try that and we'll put you out of business. By the way, I'm not making that up, and any of you who are in small businesses around the room know that happens. Donald Trump has used that legal system as a business strategy. So as a business strategy, this hasn't happened once, it is a standard of his. He pays his subcontractors about 75 or 80% of what he owes them, says that the work was not up to standard, he's not going to pay them the rest of the 25%. And when the subcontractor protests that he had done the work up to standard, Trump's lawyers say to him, well, if you want to sue us, that's okay, but we are not going to settle. We are going to fight this, and you will pay legal fees. It'll be multiples of the money that you recover. Just shut up and take it. He has taken something that a lot of us were cynical about in the legal system as it was applied to us, and he, as President of the United States, represents someone who thrives on that kind of corruption, and that's the only word for it in the legal system. A second example has to do with truth. You know, there's a lot of validity in the accusations of fake news. There has been a serious problem of the media going with stories that turned out not to be true, or the stories were grossly misrepresented. That has been a problem. The next step that Donald Trump has taken us to is a blurring of the notion that there is such a thing as truth and not truth that we can strive to reach. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the former professor who then took a step down in the world, as far as I'm concerned, and became a senator, was fond of saying that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. And that used to be accepted, so you could hold the feet to the fire. So when CBS had the mistaken story about George W. Bush and the draft and so forth in the Vietnam War, you could establish that the facts that CBS presented were fake. They were wrong, they were false, and there had to be a retraction and the rest of that. Now we have a situation in which Donald Trump can say something that is demonstrably untrue, and he can say it again, and it doesn't make any difference that it's demonstrably untrue, because truth has lost a lot of its former meaning, and a lot of other people are picking up on that. And the third example I will give is accountability. It used to be a subset of the American creed, that in America, the great thing about America was that if you did something good, you got credit for it, and if you did something wrong, you were a man. I could give the same version for women, but I'm going to say I'm 75 years old. I'm guilty of all sorts of these solipsisms. You'd be a man and take the blame for it. And people who didn't do that were looked down on. They were whiners, or they were worse. They were evading their responsibilities. Donald Trump has taken that to a next step. He does nothing but whine. He takes the blame for absolutely nothing. It's always somebody else's fault. And he takes the credit for everything that good that happens. And if somebody else seems to be getting some of the credit for it from the press or anybody else, that person is not long for the White House. That is a statement of the way the guy operates. This is an example for the country. This is saying something that used to be a source, a reason to look down on somebody, is now something that is a standard way of operating. It takes a step further, the fraying of the soundtrack for America that I was talking about. Well, the American creed has been diminishing in its power for years. As I indicated at the beginning, that we have laid the groundwork for this. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, I could give pretty much the same lecture unchanged. I would have used other examples of what things that Americans used to be proud of as distinguishing ourselves, which she has betrayed. I could have given other examples of corruption that are seeping into the system that are as pernicious as the kinds of corruption that are seeping into the system under Donald Trump. It may be that America has been on a downward slide with regard to being creedal America. That was inevitable. But we have to recognize that something new under the American sun has been developing over the last few years. For more than a few years, more like a matter of decades, there has been in academia increasing embrace of and support for identity politics among people of color and among women. That you identify with your group, and that intersectionality, as it now calls, is the way we should conceive of people, that the group, the gender that they are, and the socioeconomic class that they are in, and the ethnicity they belong to are determinative of what happens, that they are in the grip of larger forces. That has been true for minorities, that identity politics have been embraced. It has been only in the last few years, and it got started in the year before the 2016 election cycle, as far as I can tell, that suddenly you had a whole lot of whites saying, we can play that game too. And the problem is that whites may not be the overwhelming majority they used to be, but they're still, non-Latino whites are still 60-odd% of the total population. It's one thing if an ethnic group that has 12 or 14 or 16% of the population plays identity politics. You get a nation in which 60-odd% are playing identity politics, and you have a whole new level of trouble facing you. This might also have developed absent Trump. It was in the works. There were signs of it before Donald Trump was a candidate for President of the United States. His candidacy fed upon that identity politics, and as president he has done not one single thing that I can think of to try to dampen it down. That way lies the certain end of creedal America. I am no longer worried that Trump will be a dictator, but it looks like he has a very good chance of taking the one major political institution that was still putatively defending the American creed, the Republican Party, and that he is transforming it into a party that is giving up on the creed. That battle is still being waged. You have members of the Republican Party, I'm thinking of people like Ben Sasse in particular, who are still stalwart. They're willing to cooperate with the president on policies in which they believe the policy is right, but they are in no way backing off of their support for the American creed. You have lots of others who have waffled, and you have still others who are enthusiastically supporting identity politics in the Republican Party. The battle is being waged. It's possible that after Donald Trump finishes his presidency, whether that's 3 more years or 7 more years, I suppose it's vaguely possible that everybody will say, just kidding, we're still in favor of freedom, individualism, and equality. Can you imagine how hollow that would sound for a lot of these people? I think that that's probably unlikely. Now, as usual, I have dug myself into a hole from which I cannot get out. I was saying at the reception that some people complain that my lectures leave them suicidal, and that's really not the way to get to be part of the speaking circuit. You're supposed to come up with something more heartening than that. And I spent quite a while this afternoon trying to think of what that might be, and I didn't. So I'm now going to close by addressing myself to the students here in the audience. I want to say to you that if you still consider yourself to be a person who believes in individualism, equality, and freedom as they were traditionally construed, you have to understand that you are coming of age at a time when that is on life support. And what you are going to have to decide at this point is not whether you can win if you stick with that commitment, but to decide in your own heart, in your deepest heart of hearts, what is the cause that must win if America is to be great again. Thank you very much.
Pens on note cards. We are going to begin with questions that, as you have cards filled out with questions on them, we have people at the ends of our rows. And so as those cards are passed forward, Dr. Murray, why don't I just begin with a question based on your remarks. One of the things that I quoted from the Neil Ferguson discussion, and it's present at the tail end of Coming Apart, is this search or quest for that civic great awakening, right? That whatever may be happening now in the current political moment, and however much longer it may last at the top, there is a responsibility put on us as citizens to respond. And I think you've made that call to the students here, but I think it's also a call put on all of us as leaders and citizens to respond. I wondered if either A, you're seeing any glimmers of this great awakening, or B, what would that look like?
Yeah, let me explain. I was smiling. I realized I was smiling after I closed, and the reason I was smiling is Neil Ferguson must have done so much better than this last year, knowing Neil. But in answering this question, first I'll give the thing that's bothered me the most about the period since Donald Trump was a candidate and got elected, and that is the number of people who I would have sworn on a stack of Bibles were principled conservatives or libertarians who believed in pretty much the same Madisonian view of this country that I hold. And I was wrong. And I have no problem whatsoever with people who say, hey, a lot of the things that have happened in the Trump administration are good. I have no problem with that at all. I have a problem with normalizing the way he goes about it. So that does not give me optimism. But let me then point out, religious great awakenings have been a reality in this country. 3 or 4 of them, depending on which historian you read. And they came out of nowhere. I mean, nobody in 1745 expected to have the kind of just a religious revival that you had, or in the 1820s, or in the 1880s or 1890s, or for that matter, there was a mini one in the 1970s. Nobody expected them, nobody planned them, there was no organized thing. It was as if the American people were ready to be really responsive to an appeal to their best instincts. I'll tell you what could make it happen. It could happen if you got a really charismatic leader, sort of an FDR or a Ronald Reagan for the 21st century who was committed to these ideals. Because a really attractive, charismatic leader could pull a lot of people back real quick. Problem is, why do I have... Now that was kind of an upbeat end. I'll just stop there. Go ahead. I don't...
We have a few stream and theme on the media. That is not something that is necessarily that has been discussed here, but I think it certainly could be something considered as gas on the flames and as an amplifier to some of the problems that you, I think, have clearly outlined here. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think the role of the media might be, either in where we are currently in this fractured place, and would there be a set of principles that you could foresee the media adhering to if they believed that there was a chance at a civic great awakening?
I have a little bit of good news. I think that the charges of fake news, especially those that turned out to be true, and there have been so many over the last several years, have had an effect. I think there was, for a long time, People like me and other conservatives were saying the problem with the media is they're like fish who don't realize they're swimming in water. The reporters think they're being perfectly objective and so forth. There's no conspiracy involved. They have no sense of how deeply immersed in a liberal worldview they are, and that they are simply not considering alternatives. I think there's been a fair amount of soul searching that has gone on at places like the Washington Post and the New York Times. And I think there's some evidence of that in some very detailed, long-form investigative reporting that I wouldn't have expected to see in those pages. I can't think of the specific topics right now, but these are not ones which are obviously, promoting a liberal perspective at all. And I think that journalists are increasingly sensitive to these charges and are trying to respond to them, because the fact is that a lot of journalists see themselves as objective reporters of the truth. And if that's the case, you can appeal to their own ideals and say you've fallen short, and they'll respond. The things haven't changed dramatically. They may be moving in the right direction.
On this populist era in which we find ourselves, not only here in the United States, but globally. We're now witnessing results in Italy, for example. And so a couple questions about, do you see this being the new normal? These convulsions that are happening with populist parties, both from the left and right. We certainly see populism on both the left and right here in the United States. Do you see this as the new normal?
That we are going to have to work ourselves through.
Well, I think that it's the new normal for a while, and the reason is the fault of the elites. And by the way, I have not made this sufficiently clear during the lecture. I have every bit of respect for Trump voters. I fully sympathize with their anger at the elites, and fully sympathize with why they wanted to give him a kick in the teeth. The elites' contempt for ordinary Americans and the British elites' contempt for ordinary Britons in the Brexit vote and in other places is palpable. There are, at a polite dinner party on the Upper East Side of New York or in Silicon Valley, there is no ethnic slur you can use that will not provoke immediate, probably very harsh pushback. And that's a good thing, with two exceptions. If you are at an elite dinner party in either of those places and you use the word redneck, you're not going to get any pushback. If you refer to holy rollers or Bible thumpers, you won't get any pushback. Or rednecks, working class rural Americans, and evangelical Christians are two of the only groups that it's okay to be contemptuous toward. Well, this did not go unnoticed, and so as long as the elites continue to treat the ordinary members of their own countries as, to coin a word, deplorables, they're going to pay the price for it.
We also didn't talk about in this talk, but we had a brief conversation on back at the reception, was higher education, and specifically the discipline that you hail from, political science. And it could be argued that there was a time when the social sciences really were our window into the world around us. Not only in helping us understand the world around us, but to prepare a next generation of citizens who thought in those ways. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see the social sciences today and their connection or disconnection from
Public leaders.
They are in danger of becoming completely irrelevant. If you're talking about the power of the social sciences to take a generation of students and teach them the best that has been said and thought, they've pretty much given up on that. I mean, the idea of a core curriculum that forces students to take a rigorous grounding in Western civilization, in philosophy, in literature and art, focusing on the best of the best, that's not going to happen. It's going to be silly. I mean, take a look at course catalogs. I'm sure this is not true at Pepperdine, but there are course catalogs in which you can get a degree in political science or history. You can get a degree in English literature without being required to take any Shakespeare, for example. So that's one way in which they have simply abdicated their role as conveying the best that has been said and thought. And the other thing that's going on in the quantitative social sciences that I'm most familiar with is that the social sciences are scared to death of biology. It was take the Damore memo at Google, where the guy got fired, and I read that, and as it happens, I've been reading into that literature quite extensively. Maybe one or two quibbles, but essentially he was talking about mainstream science that has been done quite rigorously among the people who are willing to tackle this topic. It's not one that says women are inferior to men at all. It is one which says there are differences that exist in profiles of characteristics. And that's not a debatable point of view from a scientific perspective, but what I've just said could be classified as hate speech in a lot of university campuses. And so at some point, the gap between what is known in biology and in genetics and in a lot of quantitative analyses of cross-national phenotypic studies and so forth, the gap between this very rigorous hard knowledge and what the orthodoxy on campuses is proclaiming is going to get so vast that the people in the hard sciences are going to look at the faculties in the social sciences and laugh at them. It may already be happening. Well, this is something the social sciences and the humanities both have to come to grips with.
We have a couple questions just specifically on your call for the American Creed and how we, if possible, understand that for today. If you've talked about that we are a creedal nation and how that's been understood traditionally. You mentioned the three elements. Is there a way that you could describe or have heard or seen how we would understand those creedal arguments effectively for today?
Well, how about just understanding them the way they've always been understood? I guess in this regard, now, there's always a problem in this, because am I saying that these ideals were realized? No. Am I denying the existence of enormous problems involving race and gender in the past? No, I'm not denying those. I'm saying that a nation can be founded on ideals that it is constantly striving to live up to, and insofar as a nation is making progress toward those ideals, people can take enormous pride in that. I don't think the ideals need to be changed. And something that strikes me constantly has to do with the immigration issue. The people that I meet that most exemplify enthusiasm for equality and individualism and freedom are immigrants. The immigrants that I deal with are better Americans than most Americans, as far as I can tell, in being really enthusiastic about that stuff. That's one of the frustrations that I have with both sides of the argument there, both those who are, I think, excessively worried about immigration and those who say that the American ideal is dead and this idea of the land of opportunity and all that is just hogwash. You go tell immigrants here that the land of opportunity is hogwash, and you'll get in a very interesting conversation. So if you want the reason that the ideals still work, I'd say look at a lot of the people who are coming here right now.
Questions. And a couple are themed around the president. You and I were discussing in the reception area a interesting op-ed piece written by Peggy Noonan in this past Saturday's Wall Street Journal, in which she shows herself to be fairly tortured over the fact that maybe it took somebody like President Trump to make some of the changes in how we view the elites. Many of the things that you describe in Coming Apart, these super zips and places where unless there was an immovable force placed upon them, that we wouldn't see some of the fracturing that we're seeing, and maybe some of the reflection, as you mentioned before, by some in the media that we're seeing. But at the same time, she is repelled by some of the ways that he's handled himself, and certainly parts of his own personal history. You mentioned in these remarks yourself that there is a tension there, that there is agreement on policy, agreement on judges that have been placed, agreement on people that have been placed throughout different agencies in the administration. But given some of the hardening that you describe here in Coming Apart with these super zips and elites that surround Washington, D.C., did it take a personality like that, even if it's just for 4 years, or should we be thinking differently?
There. It's, the old, how do you get a donkey's attention? I mean, hitting him with the 2x4 and saying, first you got to get his attention. Donald Trump was a 2x4 taken to the head of America's elites. And it got their attention in ways that it might have been hard to do before. And by the way, I think I got an insight into my own misperceptions of Donald Trump in some ways that I will add to this. I was signing books after I'd given a speech out in Colorado, during the campaign. And this woman, while I'm signing the book, says, I grew up across the street from Donnie Trump. They were in Queens. And apparently the Trumps, even though they were wealthy, were still living in a pretty middle-class neighborhood in Queens. And she said, whenever Con Ed was out there repairing the streets, Donnie would be out there talking with the guys. And all at once I said, I've been thinking of Donald Trump as this kind of nouveau riche vulgarian with gold-plated faucets and this sort of thing. And what the people who are voting for Trump is seeing is a kid from Queens who likes to talk to him. And I think that insofar as others, because look, I'm a member of the elite and I'm as subject to blind spots as everybody else, I think that maybe understanding just how inauthentic American politicians have been is a really good thing. That the plastic, caged, cribbed kind of a politician that we have seen, we may replace with more authentic people. I just like them to be more authentic, considerate, thoughtful, generous people.
On that remark. Thank you so much, Dr. Marie. So we are going to adjourn just to the back in the Executive Dining Center. We welcome you all for dessert and coffee. Dr. Murray, again, is going to join us in conversation. If you had a particular question that I wasn't able to get to, you should feel free to speak with him then. Again, I want to thank everyone here for making tonight so special. Again, Dr. Tagliaferri, Gus, thank you so much again for making tonight so special. Thank you. I also wanted to point out Matt Cutler, who is our Director of Advancement. I'm not sure, he is right over here on the right. We have a number of other terrific events coming up, both luncheons and evenings for the rest of the semester. If you'd like to get on our mailing list for future events, please contact Matt on the way out. Dr. Murray, again, thank you so much for giving a terrific talk this evening. And we are not adjourned. We continue on to the reception. Thank you.